Yeah, that's good, I think. Yeah. Perfect. Thanks, buddy. Okay, sorry about that. Good morning. Um, Welcome to Hump Day. It's Wednesday. Hopefully you're all feeling all right in terms of energy. Yeah, it looks like everybody's feeling great. We're still in the week of kind of front end and dealing with Tweeter. Hopefully that's going well for you, for everybody here. Enjoying the CSS time. I see a lot of good memes on the channel. I agree with most of them. It's definitely interesting and different to work with CSS. Have you guys kind of noticed that, like, have you felt it? Yeah? Why is it so different working with CSS? Why is it so different? This lecture is not about CSS, but it's a good talking point. There's no logic. Yeah, you're onto something. There's no logic to it. It's just madness. No. There's a little bit more to, like, doesn't it feel like a different language completely? What's so different about it? It's hard to articulate, but can somebody try to make that attempt? Like, how is it so different from what you're used to? Tell me in English why it's so different. Yeah.
Like I can't figure out where the starting point is and like what the process of like iterating through like an object in JavaScript.
Yeah, you're onto something. Yeah.
In CSS, it's just like you select this thing and then you just like put something in there.
Yeah.
Change it. That's it.
Right. It's more about the objective, not about the how.
Yeah.
It's like what I want versus how I want to do it. In JavaScript, it's like, in order to solve a problem, you think about, like, how am I going to instruct the machine to do that? I'm going to need a loop. I'm inside the loop. I'm going to need an if statement. Or I'm going to need an object outside the loop to keep track of things. Things like that. And then you actually instruct the machine to go through step by step how to solve a problem, as though the machine were, like, dumb, essentially, right? Is that fair? That's a style of programming that most languages have. CSS, you don't really do that, do you? You kind of just say, this is what I want it to look like, and kind of cross your fingers and hope it works out. Right? I want this div or this area to look red. So you set the background color to be red. You don't say loop through coordinates 0, 0, because that's where this box starts, and then draw pixel, and then here's the color to use at that location. And you don't do that as a nested loop to do it X and Y, right? You don't do it that way. So you're not actually writing imperative style programming, which is giving instructions, will be that loop. Instead, you're actually giving it more of the declarative style. I declare it should be red, right? And that comes with very different kind of power, right? It gives us a lot of flexibility and power because we can get stuff done faster. We don't have to draw that. You don't have to do that whole task, using 2 loops to draw something to make something red. And you can just do that in 2 lines of code. So it's a lot more powerful, but it also is a lot more abstracted away from us, right? We don't really know how it's working underneath, like how the engine, the browser itself, makes something red. And so when stuff doesn't work well, we have to really, really start to dig in and understand the drawing engine. Like, how does it actually draw, right? What are the rules? Travis on Monday was going over some of those rules, right? What are they called? I always forget the term. Specificity, right? In terms of, like, what's more important and not. That's one example. The box model is another example. Another case of another point inside of the whole drawing engine to understand, right? So there's just a lot of different technologies being used that we're not familiar with. And on top of that, the language style is very different. It's not just that the syntax is different. It's that the way you think and the way you actually write your code is very different, which means debugging is very different, which means problem solving is very different, right? Like, those things change. And actually, when you get to databases in week 5, you'll find that same kind of thing, except it's not visual anymore. It's not about drawing things on a page. It's about retrieving data from a database using SQL, a language you may have heard of. Maybe even some of you have worked with it already a little bit. If you haven't, don't worry about it. The point is that that language is also declarative. You don't write how to retrieve the data from the database. You write what you want back. And then you kind of have to start understanding how that syntax works in terms of giving implicit direction, not direct direction, right? But it's an important skill. How many people here feel like, out of curiosity, are really enjoying front-end dev or have previously done some front-end stuff or can see themselves, how many people here can see themselves being more focused on front-end dev, stuff that shows up on the page? I'm curious in this cohort. Only a few of you. Kind of surprised. So we have 3 hands go up? That's it? Does Twitter just discourage the rest of you? You're like, oh, I want to deal with this. Hopefully when you get to React Week and you get to see some of the more, it's still declarative, but there's some like more JavaScript and more kind of modern frameworks in front end, maybe that'll change your mind a little bit. But it is very exciting times for front end technologies right now. There's a lot of stuff changing. There's a lot of complexity that's actually been introduced into how we, as people, consume web applications. It's very different than when I started using the internet, where it was mostly just flat pages, right? Like I remember the days of like pre-Google Maps, where there wasn't things like AJAX, right, which is what we're going to talk about today, where like every time you move the map, it was like a whole page refresh, right? And so stuff has changed. Our expectations on how web applications work has changed, which means that the role of a web developer or a front-end developer is actually a lot more challenging, a lot more fun, a lot more complex. Right? So there's quite a few opportunities out there for that type of role. Anyway, what are we talking about today? We're going to go. We've already done spent a little bit of time as of yesterday on JavaScript, right? On using jQuery. And today, we're going to go further and start actually connecting and wiring our tweeter with the backend, right? And actually like making some requests for data. So that'll be interesting and fun. That's what we're going to be talking about. So there's this term that's used a lot when it comes to building web applications of any kind. It doesn't have to be something like Twitter, where it's a single-page application. And this term is called AJAX. Out of curiosity, if somebody wants to maybe take a stab at explaining what AJAX is, not necessarily just what the acronym stands for, but also what it is, maybe from prior experience or having done some reading ahead or something. It's a good answer, mostly there. So the answer is it allows us to change elements on the page without refreshing the whole page. I could do that. That in of itself is about just changing the appearance of a page, which I could do, with or without AJAX, because I'm essentially dynamically changing, let's say, the appearance of a button to be less opaque or something like that, right?
When it comes to like user data.
Exactly. So you want to add that whole like there has to be a server involved for it to be really involving AJAX, right? So there's a hint. Anybody want to take it further, combining these two answers and re-explain it in different words? The awkward pause. Nobody? So I guess I'll show you what AJAX looks like. It is exactly what you said, right? Like it's when things can change on the page without the whole page reloading, when there is data submitted or fetched from the server. Because generally when you have a web server, you're either fetching data or you're submitting data. Agreed? It's like a get or a post. Sure, there's other verbs, but they're essentially submitting or getting data, right? And so far with TinyApp, what we've done is whenever we've done a get or a post, it's been like a get is like you type something into the browser or you click a link and it refreshes the whole page, right? Refreshes the whole tab. Or we redirect to a URL, and again, that's like typing something into the address bar, and it again causes the whole page to change. Right? That's how TinyApp was implemented. With Tweeter, we're not going to do any of that. I mean, we could combine some of that functionality, a similar type of workflow with AJAX, but we're going to do a completely AJAX-based application, right? A single-page application, which is the page itself will never fully change. Only parts of it will change, as you mentioned. And even when we make requests to the server, we won't refresh the whole page. And that's good. Why? Why is that good?
You don't have to reload static elements.
Don't have to reload parts that are not changing?
Yeah.
And why is that good? I guess I could ask why on that.
Load time.
Load time. So it feels and is often faster, more responsive, right? More snappy. Any other benefits? Yeah, overall better user experience, I guess, which would be kind of the umbrella answer to everything, right? It's really about improving user experience and user flow, like how they interact with the website. And generally, when AJAX came out, the web started to feel a lot more, websites started to feel more like web applications, right? Before it was about like loading a document, and you would see the document load every time, no matter what you did, submit a form, click on a link. Now, that may happen on some sites, but on sites that are AJAX heavy, it feels like a desktop application, doesn't it? Right? For example, Slack. We use Slack as a desktop app, most of us, I assume, not in the browser. Anybody using it in the browser? Because you can, right? You can use Slack in the browser. You can go to lighthouse-students.slack.com and log in with those same credentials, and you've got the entire Slack app, but it's running in the browser, right? And it behaves exactly the same way as it does in your desktop app. Same layout, same look and feel, same functionality. You don't get any kind of degraded experience, maybe because it's running in a browser, maybe if your browser's being slow, sure. But like in terms of the actual user experience, it's overall the same. So it's better UX, and overall its mission is to essentially allow websites to behave more like apps, desktop apps, native almost, you know? Even though you're writing stuff in JavaScript, HTML, CSS, you're now starting to build more rich user experience as a result. And that's why that's the focus of this week, is to try and build a relatable project that helps us understand some of the core technologies that we can use. And AJAX is one of those core technologies. So coming back to what is AJAX, it stands for, in fact, let's just load it up here in terms of MDN. So yes, it's a place in Ontario, not a fun place to go really, near Toronto. But that's not the definition on MDN. The definition on MDN is asynchronous JavaScript and XML. That's what it stands for, asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And it's a really freaking confusing name. Let's break that name down. First of all, XML. We're not going to be doing any XML with AJAX. We're going to be doing what we're comfortable with in terms of data transfer. We're comfortable with JSON or JSON to transfer data. That's what a lot of people these days are using. Less and less adoption of XML, right? So why the hell XML is in that name is really kind of weird and confusing. So that's already throwing us off. And then asynchronous JavaScript. JavaScript is asynchronous in nature. So no kidding. It's always asynchronous. So that name itself is completely useless because it tells me nothing about what it actually is, right? So that obviously adds to the confusion. It's asynchronous, yes, like we're asynchronously loading data or submitting data so that it's not taking up the entire tab or window and hijacking the entire user experience. But it's asynchronous network requests, asynchronous communication, asynchronous data flow, something like that. It was coined in 2005 and describes a new approach to using a number of existing technologies together, including HTML and XHTML, CSS, JavaScript, the DOM, and most importantly, this thing here. So there's this object that browsers expose called the XML, again, misnamed, in my opinion, XML HTTP request. At that time, the name made sense because that's what they were using. They were using XML. XML HTTP request. So that means that if I open up DevTools, I have access to things like window or document or navigator. These are top-level objects that give me some details about the browser, or I can do things to the window using these objects. One of the other ones is XML HTTP request. OK, so what's that about? And also, they also mentioned, right? It stands for XML, but JSON is more used than XML. We're not going to be using the XML HTTP request object directly in the browser. We could. We could look up the documentation for XML HTTP request, maybe MDN or W3 Schools or something. And let's just go to some example code somewhere. Thanks, MDN. This is not helping at all. Maybe on the left, there's like a using. There we go. Using it. So you could write create a new instance of this XML HTTP request using this new thing. And then you would use that object to add an event listener. You would then call an open to do a GET request on a specific URL, right? This is what makes a request. And then you would do a .send. There's quite a bit of code here to essentially make a request. It's a bit too much. Do you remember how we made a request from Node in week 2? For JSON data? We used the request library. All we said was request and gave it a URL. Remember? And we had a callback to deal with the results. And then we switched to promises, where we used the request library with promises. Right? So instead of giving it a callback, we said request, and then we did a .then. But it was the same idea. It was a very small function call. It wasn't this much code. This is way too verbose. It was fine for 2005. At that time, this was exciting. This was new. And there wasn't a need for abstraction yet. But now we have libraries like jQuery, or even better libraries than jQuery, that have a lot more elegant APIs, a lot more elegant functions that we can use to make AJAX calls or make XML HTTP requests, even though they're not XML. So that's what we're going to look at today. What my plan in the agenda is that we would kind of look at AJAX, some examples of it, and then build a small little app using jQuery. Even though we don't have to use jQuery, we're going to use jQuery this week and today to make AJAX requests. And we'll just do a small little app to get and post, so that you get to see both the form submission as well as requesting data and how that works. Is that OK? That's my plan. So let's just see AJAX in action quickly. I have a couple examples that I decided I would show. One is this very simple website. I'll just go to it right now. Coolers. It allows you to quickly generate different color codes that are nice. They work well together. It's a nice color swatch, right? And people use this for midterm projects or final projects or projects in general to come up with cool combinations of colors that work well together. And this will be something we'll show you later on anyway. But that's not why I'm showing it to you. I thought, you know what, maybe when you hit spacebar, this thing makes an AJAX request, because it's not changing the whole page. It's just changing this part here. I can see that other things on the page, just the way it works, I can kind of feel that there's not a full page reload happening here. So before lecture, I figured this is probably a good site to use as a demo to show how AJAX is being used to update the page, as we were talking about, right? So I did some examination. I opened up DevTools, and I went into the network tab, because AJAX is about making network requests, right? HTTP requests. And I said, well, I expect to see XML HTTP requests when I hit spacebar, every time I hit spacebar. So So I'm going to hit refresh on this page. And we can see there's a bunch of XHR requests, but I'm going to clear those because I want to see XHR requests that happen while I'm using the app, right? Not just at the page load. And so when I hit spacebar, there is a request. There is an AJAX request. But when I hit spacebar again and again, cool, requests, right? However, when I look at the response, nothing is coming back. So this is an example of, this is not what I exactly thought would happen. This is an example where the request in the background isn't actually being used to decide the colors, which is interesting. I don't think it is anyway. Because when I look at it, these requests are happening, like it's making requests. Like let's take a look at the headers. You guys are probably familiar with the network tab and looking at requests, right? Even from TinyApp. Well, it's making a request to this URL called /a/spacebar. It's a post request, so it's submitting some data. It's not fetching information. That's my first clue. Like, why is it submitting data? It should be fetching colors, right? So it should be a get. By the way, spacebar is what I'm hitting to change things. I'm guessing there's a button I can click to, but spacebar is like their default way of doing it. Maybe that's why they call the URL spacebar. I don't know. And when I look at the form, that like there's data that's submitted. And all it is how many times I've pressed spacebar. So 1. On this request, 1. 1. And then response is empty. So I guess they're just using this for, what do you think? Why do you think they're doing this? They're not getting any valuable stuff for the page itself. They're just submitting data behind the scenes that we don't even know about, and it says hits 1, hits 1. What is that? It seems to have no effect on actually displaying or fetching data. Why are they submitting hits 1? And I noticed before lecture when I was doing it, like I did it a bunch of times, like watch this, spacebar, spacebar, spacebar. They make a request, and it says like hits 3, because I pressed spacebar 3 times. So it's not always 1. Just to figure out how many times what? How many times they have to switch the colors? But the colors have already switched 3 times, and then it makes a call. Like watch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Request. I found this interesting. It's not what I expected when I loaded up this site as an example, but I thought it would be still a cool talking point. Why is this happening? Why do you think the developers decided to do this, or the business owners decided this was a good idea? Yeah. For analytics, that's my guess as well. I'm fairly sure this is just their kind of easy implementation of, over a course of, I don't know, a day or a month or a week, how many spacebar hits do we get? Right? So AJAX isn't just used. It's a good learning because it doesn't fall into this category, right? It doesn't fall into the category of improving the user experience. It did nothing for the user experience. But it helps solve a different problem, right? It also can be used to do things behind the scenes that the user doesn't even notice, like analytics. Are you guys familiar with Google Analytics? It's a tool that's very often used and probably installed on millions of websites. Probably the most installed web analytics tool out there. And there's many other alternatives as well. Some open source, some more specialized. You install these scripts on your page, and they give you dashboards. You can log into those websites, and you can get dashboards. How are they doing user tracking? They're not affecting user experience. But behind the scenes, they're making these XHR requests, these XML HTTP requests, using JSON probably, to submit and request data and track users. Right? Same thing with Facebook, with the script that they give to people to do things like Facebook Connect, and they're able to track people across the internet as well with some of the other technologies. We've learned about cookies last week, right? So combining cookies and AJAX, all of a sudden you've got stateful tracking behind the scenes without the user realizing it. So it has that benefit as well, or drawback, depending on how you look at it. OK, so does that give us a good picture? If not, there's this diagram here that also shows kind of what's happening behind the scenes. There's the user interface, which makes a JavaScript call at some point to say, oh, I need to load some more data, or I need to submit some data, in this case, spacebar. And there's an HTTP request that's made, except the UI is not disturbed. The page doesn't go white or start loading. So it's happening behind the scenes. It's now up to the developer if they want to show a spinning thing or not. And then there's some server stuff that's happening, just like before. Maybe it's an Express server. And it's doing its thing. It makes a database call, gets some data back maybe. And if it's a request for information, it's going to send back some information, maybe in the form of JSON or XML, or could even be other formats. Could be HTML. And that snippet of data can then be used in this callback, whether it's a callback that's traditional or promise-based, doesn't really matter, right? You get data back. And then you can decide to make DOM updates if you want. If it was an error, you might want to show a erroring DOM update, like the network request failed or something like that, right? The other demo I want to show you is something Lighthouse actually has, which is going to launch soon. This one's the old one that we ran last year, which is the 21-day coding challenge. If you haven't heard of it, we're going to be launching it in November. Essentially a 21-day coding challenge where, like, every day you log on, you submit a piece of code to solve a simple problem. It's for new developers to get them excited about coding. And there's like prizes for, like, there's like leaderboards, there's teams, there's prizes. It's a cool little thing that we're doing, and we've done it before many times. Last time the space was like the theme was space. This time the theme is different. Actually, Nima's working on a lot of those challenges. So if you do end up taking the challenge, although it'll probably be too easy for you, the questions and the themes and stuff are partly built by Nima and some of the other team members at Lighthouse. Anyway, the reason I bring it up is because it has these like challenges that you can go into, and similar to what you see in Compass, where, like, in the prep course you could like type in some code and then you get back some errors or lint errors, or like a success, saying like you've passed the challenge. This is a very similar implementation, except it's done with Node on the back end instead of Rails. And it's got that code editor, right? Oops. And I was messing with James earlier. And you can kind of see the results of your code, any console log outputs that you've got, things like that, right? So if I was to actually go in and hit run code here, I don't want the whole page to reload. That would just be a shitty user experience. Do we agree? Right? And so when I hit run code, it says running. Oh, I guess it ran. And I got like a failure back with a hint and a message and some additional stuff, right? And if I open up the network tab, by the way, you have to kind of, it doesn't show previous ones, so you have to kind of cause a XHR request after the fact. So here we are running code again. So it makes a request to test code. So /challenge/test code. And let's take a look at what happened. We can learn a lot about a website or a web application, about how it works, just by using DevTools and looking at this network tab, right? So it made a post request. What did it send up? So let's look at the request. It sent up form data, num:1, and code : and then the whole string for the code that was in there, right? And then the response is JavaScript, or a string that represents JSON, JavaScript object notation. So we can kind of see a whole bunch of stuff that's not easy to look at, so we'll look at the preview version. You can see results. It's an array. It has a hint. It has status, fail explanation, right? It's actually with the data that's coming back from the server saying what went wrong, and then the DOM is updated by additional JavaScript code that goes ahead and changes things to be red or green based on if it failed or not, and displays that text here in these different tabs. Right? You can use length to get the length of each array. That's coming from something like this, right? Or no, that's actually shown here, I think. Hint, use length to get the length of each array. Anyway, another example of using AJAX to make it feel like an actual application versus just a website. So we're going to build our own next. And what I was thinking is we would build like a simple CRUD app with a form and a list of things below. What does that sound like? It sounds like Tweeter, right? You've got the submit tweet at the top, and then you've got your list of tweets at the bottom. So it's going to be fairly similar to what you're doing, except slightly different domain. And of course, in traditional lecture style, I'm going to write the code kind of incrementally, focus on approach, right? Debugging, things like that. And then also not really focus too much on code quality and maintainability of the code. That's going to be some of the things that you'll be doing, hopefully, above and beyond what you're going to see here, right? We're limited on time. So don't expect that the code that we'll write here is like good production level code that you'll want to submit for Tweeter, for example, right? You want to improve upon it and make it more maintainable. So here's what I've got already built up. I've got a server.js. And it's like your typical Express server, right? It's using Express. And there's this database, which is an array of, in this case, creatures. We'll just do like creatures, and we'll just be able to create creatures. And that's it, right? There's nothing else in here. So we're going to have to implement the server side as well. But we're going to focus a lot on the client side, which currently looks like this. Let's actually run it and bring it up. So this is what it looks like. There's a form. It says like, what's the name, what's the type, and what's the damage that that creature can do. Okay. And then you hit submit, and it's supposed to like update the page without having to refresh the whole page. Right now, though, as we can see, if I look here, we can see that like it quickly does a submit, right? So it's a traditional form right now. We're going to have to make it behave like a non-traditional form and actually do it behind the scenes asynchronously and not reload the whole page, not submit the whole page. Are you guys with me so far? Any questions? I haven't really paused for questions yet. Any questions or thoughts or comments? About any of the stuff I've covered so far in terms of the demos that I've shown you and stuff?
Just curious. So we just looked at that example with that space bar, right? And then we saw some requests with how many feet, and then the server sends the request to
the client sends a request to the server.
The client sends a response to the server with how many feet, right?
The client sends a request to the server. It's an HTTP request of type post because it's posting data, and it's saying only one thing, which is hits, colon, and a number.
Just like curious, was it like kind of AJAX style? Because if you hit the spacebar 6 times in a short amount of time, then if you send 6 times of those requests, it's going to be a huge amount of work.
It's a good question. I don't think the question speaks to AJAX, though. It just speaks to their implementation of how they're using AJAX. They decided that every spacebar hit wasn't going to cause an AJAX request because that's too many requests. And somebody can do spacebar really fast and cause like 100 requests to go up, which is unnecessary. It's kind of a performance issue or a scalability issue. So they're like, listen, we don't need like every time you hit it, right away I need to know the space bar was hit, right? It's more about for me to aggregate. I'm guessing it's more for them to like know over a course of a month how many times the space bar was hit. So they just decided that in their code, anytime space bar is going to be hit, they're going to wait to see if a space bar is hit again in a certain amount of time. If it is, they won't make that request until we slow down. And once the user slows down, then they make that request with the number. That's a performance enhancement. Regardless, though, if they had gone with a less performance solution where they made a request every time you hit spacebar, they would still be using AJAX. They would just be using a lot more AJAX, right? It's a good question. Great question. Any others? No? OK. So let's take a look at the additional code for this. This is the server side. Then we've got the client, the index HTML. So the index HTML has a form. Right now, the form just has a class. It doesn't even have additional details about where to submit, where to submit the form or anything like that. Which we know from TinyApp that we need that, right? We need things like method post, where to go, all that stuff. Then it has fields like name, type, and damage. We're used to this. We've built forms before with TinyApp, so I'm not going to cover that. That's why it's already pre-written for us. But just as a recap, the input is obviously the important thing. That's where they're going to put in data. That's the text field that's created. And the most important part is the name, because when we submit, it uses these fields to submit key value data, right? So it'll say name is equal to whatever I type into the name, or type is equal to whatever I type into the type. So just a quick recap there. If I create, somebody give me a fictional creature. Anything? Pikachu. That's exactly the one I was thinking. Is that you? Nice. Oh, is that how you spell Pikachu? I think it's like this. I knew that. What kind of creature is that? I guess it's a Pokemon? And I don't know if Pikachu's a badass, but we're going to make it have 20 damage. Submit. First of all, that gets cleared. But because the form doesn't have any extra attributes saying how to submit the form, it defaults to a get. But what we get to see is like those input names. The 3 that I showed you are actually the keys for the values that I put in, right? So the name is Pikachu, the type is Pokemon, and the damage is 20, right? So those input names are quite important. IDs, classes, those are just for like styling or doing client-side things. What actually gets submitted via the input field is the name and the value. OK, so we're somewhat comfortable with forms. And then we've got this container, which is supposed to have the list of creatures that are already in the database. Right now, that's not working. So we're going to have to wire that up so that it loads the data. But we're not going to be using EJS. We're not going to like, loop through the creatures in this HTML file. This HTML file is static. This is the stuff that's sent down. It's always going to be an empty container, just like with Tweeter. And then when the page loads, we're going to have to make a request to get all the creatures right when the page loads, because we want to show all the creatures that are already in the database. So we're going to have to write JavaScript code to use that XML HTTP request object to make that GET request to fetch those creatures using JSON, get that back, and then render that information in here. And then the other thing we'll have to wire up is that the form will be able to submit that data. So I have 2 different features or functionalities that I need to implement for this whole thing to work. I need to implement the submit, which is the form, and I need to implement the list, which is the fetch. The get and the post both have to be submitted. Both have to be implemented. And they are both separate kind of features, if you will. Right? Separate functionality. Which one should I start with? Any ideas? No wrong answer here, but maybe a better than the other approach, I would argue. Like one is probably an easier approach than the other. Which one should I start with? Should I start with the form, or should I start with fetching the list? Fetching the list, says Anthony. Any objections or reasons for why? Anybody? Anybody? And I already have, right? I've already hard-coded the data on the server. So to get the UI kind of working, it'd be nice to get the list showing on the page, right? And that way, when I submit the form, I can hopefully leverage that list showing up on the page to say, OK, how do I refresh this now, right? Because remember, we're not going to redirect back to this page, so it's not going to automatically refresh with the newest data. We're going to have to manually do that. Right? So OK, let's start with the, not that one answer is wrong. You could start with submitting with the form and debug that first. But I'm going to go with the list approach that you guys mentioned. Okay. So we need to basically, in this creatures list, we should be showing what each creature's kind of information is, right? It doesn't have to be clever. I'm not trying to build a real app here. So we'll just do like a paragraph or something where it will show like name, and then it will have the name, right? And then, and maybe that'll be like bolded or something. You know, it'll kind of be like this, right? With a bunch of other information. But of course, I'm not going to hard code this in here. I need to actually dynamically load this from the server upon page load, right? So this is just there to remind me what I want it to look like and what I want it to actually accomplish. But let's figure out how we're going to get there with code. So what I'm going to need is some JavaScript. I could put JavaScript right here on this page and start like going at it, right? And like start writing logic. But that's not generally a good approach. You want to put it in a separate file, right? So it's not just one big giant HTML page with all our code. So what I decided was I created this app.js file. And I've already got one line in it called hello from app.js. Because it's a good like initial step to just be like, is this file loading? Is this file working or not? And so I expect to see this hello from app.js when I look at the console. Yet when I refresh, that is not the case. I'm not seeing that thing being logged at all. So I've already created an intentional error situation. Because that's how I work, right? I work incrementally, I cause an error, and then I fix it. So the first step was cause this problem. This error is that the console log is not showing up. Why would it not be showing up? Any guesses?
Did you link it?
I did not link it. So there's a style sheet being linked here. And there's a jQuery script tag to link JavaScript, jQuery to our page so we could use jQuery. But right after jQuery, I should load the, and where's app.js? It's in public JS folder. So I'm going to say /js/app.js. Going to refresh the page, and I see the hello from app.js. Any questions so far? Now, in this case, I've added the script to the bottom of the page, as you notice. Anybody know why I did that? That might have been covered yesterday. Yep. Exactly. So I'm guessing this was covered yesterday in lecture. OK, great. So yeah, this is not necessary, but it is quite often done as a pattern to just ensure that the JavaScript is loading last once the DOM or the page has actually loaded into memory, so that if we wanted to access the DOM, like create new elements on the page or something like that, that we actually have a DOM tree that we're working with.
Did you just use document.ready?
Yes. I was hoping somebody would ask. So you could just put things in head. And I bet you if I open up a website right now, I don't know, let's pick one. I like to just go to IGN a lot because I'm a gamer. And if I look at their source, I haven't, oh boy, this is not the easiest one to look at. Let's use inspect elements. It cleans things up a little bit. I bet you right there in the HTML, literally right in the HTML. They're not even like using a head tag. They're putting script tags right at the beginning, right? And maybe even at the end. Look, they're doing both, right? There's the body closing, and there's a script tag right before. And then there's the HTML tag opening, and there's a bunch of script tags right there. So they're doing both for whatever reason. Some sites might do one or the other. New York Times. This is their source code, a little bit easier to read. They've got a link tag, which is for something else. They've got a script with inline JavaScript right in the page, lots of it, and it's no longer easy to read. So we're going to use the Elements tab again, and we find that, yeah, there's script tags right at the beginning of the HTML document. And let's look at the body. Oh, and that's even before the head. Like, they don't even put it in the head, which is really weird. The head has additional script elements. Like, what is even going on? Why is there script outside the head and then inside the head as well? And then at the end, they've got some script tags here as well. So like, it seems like production sites start to get messy maybe, or maybe they're doing it intentionally, maybe unintentionally. There's developers adding stuff everywhere in terms of script tags, right? Pretty interesting. Yeah?
Why do they say async source? Does it really matter?
Where does it say that?
If you scroll all the way up, I think it's at the very top. It says like async source for some of their like async ID, async source.
Yeah, so async is an attribute that you can apply to a script so that the script doesn't block loading, so it's actually more performant. It's like a new attribute. You can look it up. You can just type in script and then async, and you'll find that it's like a newer HTML5 thing that just tells the browser, like, listen, load this kind of behind the scenes. Don't because traditionally a script tag will like block the rest of the page from loading until that thing is downloaded. So it slows the page. It will feel slower when it's loading. So it's a performance thing. But if you're putting it at the end of the page, then you may not need to use it, right? OK, so app.js is working. And we gotta, who was it that talked? It was you that talked about using document ready, right? Yeah. What's your name? Andrew. So what I like to do is I like to have it generally at the, not that it's necessary, but have it at the bottom of the page, but then also use document ready, such that if it's ever moved to the top of the page, the script doesn't just stop working. It doesn't care where it's inserted. It'll always kind of behave well and wait for the DOM loaded event. And we could do that using the browser DOM loaded, but jQuery gives us a much easier syntax for that, which is just use a $sign thing and give it a function, and that is your DOM loaded callback function. The other approach is that you might have seen is document.ready, and then you give it a function in here, right? Same thing. This one's obviously not as understandable, but if you know jQuery, it's understandable, right? It's really weird because the $sign thing is used everywhere in jQuery. So depending on what you pass in, it does something different. In this case, because I'm passing in a function, it means DOM ready function. So this is my DOM ready. And now I'm going to console log yo. I wonder what happens. I haven't tried this recently. But like, which one will show up first? We can take a guess. We can take an educated guess. Which one will print first? Will it be the hello or will it be the yo? Because the yo isn't a callback, so it should be a little bit slower, even if DOM ready is like pretty much right there, since our script is at the bottom of the page, right? I still think it'll be like a millisecond later, right? So we're actually going to see hello and then yo, I think. Hello and then yo. Right, so this triggers a little bit later because it ensures that the DOM is loaded. And now we can start doing AJAX stuff. This is like kind of the stuff that we can start doing. Oh, it's 10:55, so this is actually a perfect time to go take a break. And then after the break, we'll start kind of getting into the meat of our demo. OK, so we'll take a 10-minute and resume at 5 after. looks good, eh? Did you change the red background now? Or is it supposed to look like that? The old tweeter looked much uglier.
Yeah, I heard that from my girlfriend that also.
Oh, she did, yeah. So she would have done tweeter as well, right?
Yeah.
It looked very different for her, I'm sure.
I think same thing with Tanya.
Yeah, it was really ugly.
It
Yeah.
was like no strap loaded.
With 12 week, I wanted to kind of clean up the look of everything,
Right.
so that it feels people enjoy working on it more, and then also easier for like resume, right? Like it looks nicer, so it's perceived better.
It's more fun to work.
Yeah, look exactly. It feels like when things work, you're like, oh yeah, like that feels like I'm making a real app, you know?
Yeah.
Versus something that's just black and white.
Like quite a lot. We like change it.
Oh yeah, the
Yeah.
live thing, yeah. So that's an example where it's not AJAX, it's just JavaScript, right? And you're just doing some, using jQuery, but we could have not used jQuery and just done some event listeners, and right? This is the stuff from yesterday, I believe, right? Like just that first bit with jQuery. The character counter is yesterday, right? Yeah. I forgot to check how caught up you guys are with yesterday's stuff. Usually I do that before lecture. Are you guys, like, is everybody, at least at this pod, are you guys done with yesterday's stuff, or still? Huh? Oh, okay. So you're about a day behind, essentially? Not the end of the world. You should be okay. This week's not as intense.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
How to change?
Yeah, you could do that. I would just say prioritize, right? So you don't want to use that. You don't want to fall behind as a result. So time box it. Yeah. Okay, good. So just time box it, and you could stretch at the end of the week maybe. But if you just feel like doing it now, that's totally cool. Not now, as in like during lecture, but. Okay, so we're going to resume. It's 6 after. Everybody back? Mostly awake, except for one dude over there. Had a long night? You had a long night? Taking a power nap during the 5-minute, 10-minute break? I like it. I like it. I wish I could take a power nap like that. It's pretty awesome. Do you guys hear a thing? Is it from the? Yeah, it sounds like it's coming from outside. That is really. I thought my ears were ringing. It's like, oh, having a stroke. We actually have to start writing some JavaScript code. We've done very little on that front on the client side in order to start loading data, our creatures, from our server side, our fake database. What are we going to do to start things off? Well, we need to actually, right when the page loads, we need to start loading data. We need to start fetching data. So now I'm getting right into the how do I do AJAX problem, right? So if I actually Google AJAX and I know I'm using jQuery, I'm going to start making some headway. As it turns out, jQuery has a function exactly with the same name, AJAX. And their documentation is a little bit hard to get used to. I'm not a big fan of it in terms of how they laid things out. But hopefully it will give us some insight. So what does this function do? A very short description. It performs an asynchronous HTTP request. Great. Whole bunch of goes straight into like parameters. I want to see examples. Like, what is this? I'm just going to scroll down. The function underlies all AJAX requests sent by jQuery. It is often unnecessary to directly call this function. Interesting, as several higher-level alternatives like get and load are available and easier to use. That's cool to know. What we'll do is we'll still use AJAX so that we get a little bit more acquainted with the more powerful function in jQuery. But just know that there's other more like easier functions that you may want to use for Twitter that isn't exactly this function. It talks about kind of the object that's returned, the jQuery XHR object. Talks about different versions doing different things. That's great. I just want to see some examples. So there's like a .ajax call, and then you give it an object. Can you guys see that? Where'd it go? Ah, sorry. You give it an object with the URL for what you want to load, and then a .done that takes a callback function with that's given the data when it's done with the request. It's interesting. I'm used to promises. So .done isn't what we use with promises. We use .then, right? So I wonder if it supports .then. I'm going to just search on the page for .then. And as it turns out, that the response, sorry, the object does support .then as well. So it's kind of behaves like a promise as well, which is nice. Let's see if they even mention the word promise here. Oh yeah, promise, underlying promise. So behind the scenes, there's a promise. Anyway, I'm going to use .then. Okay, cool. So what we're going to do is $.ajax. And in other examples, they show jQuery is pretty confusing, right? Because you can these functions are very flexible. You can pass in an object, but you can also pass in like a string and an object in this case. For example, in this case, it's the URL, and then they use the .then or .done. So let's we can take a look at that as well. .always. It's something that they have, but I think our native promises don't have. I do like .always, but we'll talk about that separately. It's not really important right now. So we'll just give it the URL. Let's just say we will request data. Because it's on the same server, we don't have to say http://localhost 8000. In fact, if I do say that, that's going to be confusing because when I deploy this app, it's going to try and request from localhost while it's running in the cloud. That doesn't make any sense. So in fact, I'm going to use a relative URL like this. So wherever it's at, if it's hosted at kvsexamplesite.com, it'll just do kvsexamplesite.com / whatever URL I give it here. So we'll call it creatures.json maybe, because we want to fetch the creatures in JSON format. And just that alone should be enough code to make the request. Now, I haven't told it to make a get or a post, so I expect that by default, it'll probably make a get by default. Okay? Just like with forms. Let's take a look. Where's our app? Right here. I haven't changed anything on the node side, so I can hit refresh here. And immediately on page load, let me just clear it and hit refresh again. Immediately on page load, I see an attempted but failed GET request for creatures.json. Just one line of code to make an AJAX request. Nothing complicated, right, guys? Of course, in this case, though, it's a 404. Why is it a 404? I showed you the server code. It didn't have any endpoints. It didn't have any routes set up yet. So we're going to have to set that up. Maybe that's the next thing I solve, is to implement that server-side endpoint, even though in your tweeter you don't really have to do that. It's just good review, and it's pretty quick anyway. So we're going to open up our server file, where we have the creatures array. And right before listen, we can attach some endpoints. So app.get creatures, don't need the slash there, I don't think, .json, and then my request response callback function that we're used to doing with Express. Remember this? Last week, it feels like a long time ago. It's like, what? I don't remember this. And then we just basically want to send back the JSON, right? What we're used to doing is something like this, right? It will like render index.erb, or sorry, EJS, right? For embedded JavaScript. But we can also just send back JSON. We don't have to load a template from the views directory or anything like we did with TinyApp. We can just say, take this data, turn it into a string, JSON format, please, and send it down. What are we going to send down? Well, we could send down an array of numbers. Send down anything. Send out back an object. Why is it red? Oh, because I'm missing the arrow. It's like very confused about what's going on there. There we go. Because I didn't have the arrow, it's really strange. Because I didn't have the arrow, it was like, this is some stuff that's in parentheses. It doesn't look like you're calling a function though. And then you're setting it to be an object? So it was quite confused. Anyway, arrow function. And sending back JSON 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So now when I refresh, well, I have to restart the server. When I refresh, I still have a 404, which is strange. It is a get, so that's good. Creatures.json, maybe I have to do / creatures.json. Maybe. Strange. There we go. So now we're making a request successfully. I don't see any errors in console. I'll have to go into the network tab. Let's clear it and refresh the page. And we see as soon as the page loads, there's a request. And the response is an array. Right? If we look at the actual response, like right here, it's just a string. Right? It's just data as text. But it then gets converted automatically, hopefully, into an array on the client side. So I'm working incrementally here. I don't want an array of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but I just want to see, like, can I get that data out from that jQuery call? Because right now, I just made a very simple AJAX call, and I don't have a callback to handle the data. Right? I am curious, as pretending to be somebody who's learning this for the first time, I'm curious what comes back here. So I'm just going to console log that object that's returned by the AJAX thing. Is it going to be the data? No. Because remember that this is an async call. And whenever we want to return or retrieve values from an async call, it's through callbacks, even when we're using promises. And so this is not going to be our data. This is going to be some kind of an object that behaves like a promise. Let's take a look. It's what the jQuery thing was calling the this JQ XHR object, the jQuery XML HTTP request object. Let's go ahead and console log it. We see that it is indeed an object with a whole bunch of methods, including .then. Right? So we're going to do r.then, although I don't really need to do it that way. I can just do a .then right after without the semicolon there. And there's going to be my callback to handle data. This hopefully looks familiar, right? We've kind of played with promises before in week 2. We didn't really get a chance to play with promises in TinyApp, but they're back, right? We're not building promises or anything crazy like that. We're just using a library that can be used with promises. So I go ahead and I hit refresh, and I expect to see, oh, nice, and it behaves like an array. It's already automatically converted to an array for us, instead of just being a text string, which is how it comes in initially. So jQuery is doing some work for us without even us realizing it, in just encoding or decoding that JSON into an actual object using json.parse. All right, it's using that behind the scenes. I don't have to do that myself. It's like, oh, this looks like JSON. I'll just convert it over to, I'll just use json.parse. Any questions so far? Yeah?
I thought the syntax was dot.
There is a .done as well. So you could use .done. And you can read about the difference there. It's slight difference. I just like to push people to use .then because it's consistent with how promises generally work. And many of the other alternatives to jQuery, like Axios and others, that we can use for AJAX calls. You'll use Axios when you get to future weeks. They use promises and .then. jQuery is a little bit more of because it's so old, it started without promises and then it kind of evolved into promises. So it supports the pre-promise approach and then the promise-based approach as well. Good question. Any others? Now we need to actually send back creatures, right? We're not sending back an array, so I'm going to switch this to be the object or array that we have up here. It's called creatures. So now when I restart and load this, I expect to get back an object with, an array of 2 objects. Right? Very, very easy to implement on the server side. Not much code. Right? And not much code actually on the client side either. Like this isn't rocket science, right? It looks very similar actually to the request thing that we did in week 2. Wasn't it something like this? Remember this? Request, and then there was a .then. So jQuery has also evolved to kind of behave very similar to modern libraries, even though it wasn't modern in terms of when it started, right? It was obviously modern for its time, but it started a long time ago. Request came much later. Okay, so we have the data. Now what? Now comes the tedious part. I actually have to update the DOM myself, right? So I'm going to maybe pass this whole data to a function so that I'm not having to do everything in this callback. And maybe it will be something like build creatures or something like that. Is that fair? Although if I'm using a callback function to then call another function, I might as well, with the same signature, I might as well just make that the callback function. So just please call build creatures when the data comes back, right? And pass in whatever arguments you normally pass in. So let's go ahead and define that function. I'm not passing the data, but the .then it takes in a callback that is given the data anyway. You saw me do an arrow function where I took in the data. This is the equivalent of that arrow function that's taking in the data. Now it's a named function. So I'm organizing my code better as I go versus all at the end, right? And there was no reason to have a callback that all it did was pass the same data to another function. Might as well just pass that original function straight in to the .then. So it's just a cleanup, essentially. And we've got that going with, hopefully that works. So we should still see the thing console logging. Perfect. And in here, I'm going to have to loop through all the creatures, right? And build elements for them, right? And I know I can use jQuery for that. But let's loop through them first. So for const creature, it's an array, so of creatures. And then console.log creature, just because I'm making sure I'm not breaking anything as I go. And it's not creatures, sorry, it's, well, I guess I'll call this creatures, right? So it's taking in the creatures array, and then it's looping through it. And for now, we're just console logging, just because we're working step by step. So we see create creature, as we expected. What's next? Awkward pause. What's next? Still haven't accomplished what I set out to accomplish, which is to update the page. So we're still working towards that. What is a good next step in that direction? Yeah, create the HTML. So here, how how? I guess I have, what is creature? Creatures and objects. So I can do things like creature.name, I think, right? Or type.damage.id. So we'll use those three anyway, name, type, and damage, to render, let's say, a paragraph or something. And we know that in the index page, we want it to be added to the creatures list element, which is a section. So this is the class we're going to use to access the parent, and then we'll inject more HTML into it, right? Because right now it's empty. So how do I do that? Yep. So I can use jQuery to use the class name nomenclature, like dot, creatures list, right? And again, I'm working incrementally here, so I'm just going to like go ahead and append, I don't know, creature.id in here. I know creature.id is a thing, right? It's a number. Or I could use name, I guess. Just take something and let's see if we can put it into that parent. It's a step in the right direction. It's not what we want exactly, but it's a step in the right direction. What do I expect to happen? I expect the names to start showing up in this container. Is that right? And they do. And they get appended. There's two names there. I'm going to go ahead and remove the existing paragraph there, because that was just for me to see. And we see that, yep. Now it happens really quickly, so we don't get to see that this is actually an AJAX request. But if I wanted to illustrate that, just so you guys can kind of visualize that better, I can go into the server and make that a little bit slower by just maybe doing a set timeout here to slow it down and not be so quick, because it's a very easy request. So let's pretend there's like, it needs some time, let's say 300 milliseconds, to actually respond with the data, right? It's a little bit of a more realistic web application. It's doing a bunch of stuff to fetch the data. And now we will notice that once the page loads, well, maybe 300 isn't enough. Once I refresh the page, it takes a second before it can fetch that data, right? The request has been sent. It's in our network tab. Let's resimulate. The request has been sent. It's pending. And now it's done. And it took approximately 1 second, right? See that? OK, so next up, I need to actually display this creature into the page, not just their name. So I guess I would start building like a DOM node structure, right? And we could, just give it a string. Like we could just do something like this. This is not necessarily a good approach, but I'm just showing it to you. This is just a template string, right? We know this from earlier on in the prep course in week 1 and so on. I can use string concatenation here. String interpolation using $. So we can say something like, there we go. And I can just append a string, which jQuery will automatically be nice enough and smart enough to turn that into DOM nodes. jQuery is really nice like that. If we weren't using jQuery and we were just using the browser directly, using its API, we would have to we couldn't just pass in a string like that. I guess we could. We could use inner HTML, and we could do it that way. But there's a whole bunch of problems that come with that I'm not going to get into right now. But behind the scenes, jQuery is using this code to actually build DOM nodes, which is nice. Or did that? Yeah, that seemed to work, right? We got paragraphs now. Yep. But there's actually a security problem here. Does anybody know what it is? If I do it this way? Can anybody guess what a security problem is? There's a vulnerability that I've exposed by using string interpolation and essentially concatenating this data here into the string and adding it to the DOM. It's a bit of an advanced question, and I won't go into it deep, but just something to kind of explain at least why you have to do the more arduous approach of using jQuery to build a DOM. Any ideas? Yeah, injection of what? Yeah, exactly. I'm assuming that's data, but if it's sent by a user through some kind of form, instead of putting a name in, they could have put in like a script tag. Script tag to maybe get all the cookies for this particular website, because you can just do document.cookies, and then maybe make an AJAX request to my server with all those cookies. I have all your sensitive information. Now, most sites encrypt that stuff, but you can start to see that you don't want to give them that information. Even if it's encrypted, they can still use it and start to simulate as though they're logged in as you, right? They can hijack your account. Things like that can happen. Or they could just do something less crazy and just kind of monitor and try to be behind the scenes. And, you could do malicious stuff that way. So what we don't want to do is assume that user data is clean. We always want to sanitize it. So there's different things you can do here. We can run this through a function that removes all that potential malicious code, or we just leverage jQuery to do that for us, right? So the more arduous approach to this is, instead of using a string or template string, we will actually create jQuery nodes that can be added to the DOM. How do we do that? You've done this yesterday a little bit, right? I can say, please create a paragraph tag. So that, again, is the use of a $sign function. But because I'm giving it HTML, it recognizes that it should create nodes, right? And then I want to, in fact, I'm going to do that right out here. Const creature element is equal to this. And on top of that, I want to add the class creature. And I also want to add text. For now, I'll just add text for the creature.name. And then I'm just going to append the creature element. Right, so first we're going to build the element. It's a paragraph tag with a class creature. And the text inside of it is just going to be the creature name. We obviously need more there, but I've just done something simple here. And these functions here, add class, text, these are jQuery functions, because this returns a jQuery object, right? And so it allows us to easily manipulate that DOM node. It's still only in memory, but then we want to actually add it to the page. And so we append it to this existing DOM node inside of the page. This is just a review of what was done yesterday. Is that correct? For the most part? Yeah? Okay, let's restart our server and make sure that this is working as expected. Yep. When I inspect that, I see my paragraph creature with just the text of the name. Okay. Now, of course, I can do more work here to clean this up and make this look nicer, use more jQuery DOM functions, like create another thing like a strong or additional divs or something, spans, whatever I want as part of creating the creature. And so I know that this code here to actually create the creature element is going to be a little bit big. So why don't I break that out into its own function? So I would do something like create or build creature element, and then pass in the data. And then let that be another function. Which then just returns the final DOM node that we're going to inject in the other function. So this function's job is just to return a jQuery DOM node for a given creature data. Right? Pass in the data, the name, the blah, 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 and it returns a jQuery DOM node. But before it returns it, it adds a class and some text to it. Any questions about this so far? I'm going to pause for questions, and then we're going to move on to the form, because this gives us an idea of how to fetch the data, right? I could make it nicer looking, but that's not the goal here. Any questions about any stuff we've done so far before we move on to the form? Yeah?
I still don't understand why it's safer to use the jQuery instead of just using
It's only safer if you know that you want to be safe here. So for example, I could make this unsafe even with jQuery. I could say that actually the name is any kind of HTML. So please replace the inside of the paragraph with HTML, which happens to be text. In this case, if the user has put in a script tag or a link tag or any kind of JavaScript, it will still trigger.
So even if it's .text, you couldn't put HTML inside of it, and it
That's the difference. So jQuery gives us a .text. jQuery does this, which if we look at the documentation for it, it's a great question, by the way. jQuery text, it is a safer version of HTML. It assumes, or it doesn't make the assumption that it's text. It actually enforces that it's text. Okay, and I can actually show you this difference a little bit before we get to the form stuff. But it even talks about it and compares it to HTML. Unlike the HTML method, text can be used. The result text method is a string containing the combined text of all matched elements, blah, blah, blah. So this is talking about to retrieve it, I think. So here they show an example where you pass in HTML, right, which could potentially be malicious too, into text. And what it does is it encodes it into less than, right, P, greater than. Like this is actually going to render less than, greater than, instead of actually turn into HTML. This escapes it. And so by doing that, I could write a function to do that myself, but that's going to be a pretty annoying thing to do. So we'll just leverage jQuery's function to encode that HTML into visible HTML, right? And to further illustrate that point, let's take a creature in the server right here. And let's say it's malicious, like Bigfoot, and has a script tag which just does a hello alert, right? Because I'm using .text, I think I'm using .text. Yep. It won't be anything malicious. It will just show as text. It doesn't consider that HTML. However, if I did it the other way that I showed you earlier, or forgot and used the HTML method here, like didn't do a security audit here, and some developer has forgotten that this is actually potentially malicious text, now we have a potential problem. I'm now able to inject, right, JavaScript code there. Cool. So we'll bring that back to a secure version. And that kind of does our like fetching and kind of loading on the page. Now let's actually build out the form. So the form's already built out in terms of the HTML, but it is not wired. So when I hit submit here, it like essentially reloads the whole page because it's submitting to the same page that it's on. That's what default browser form behavior. So let's first of all look at the form. So the form has a class and nothing else, right? So we're going to say, actually, we want you to submit to, with a method equals post. We want you to go to slash creatures. Yeah, just slash creatures or something like that, right? Because I want to submit a new creature. So that makes sense. Now when I refresh this and hit submit, it's trying to post now to slash creatures, which is a step in the right direction. But it's trying to do a traditional post where the whole page is wiped out because it's taking over the whole page, right? Like it's expecting that to be the main request. And it's not an asynchronous request. It's a synchronous request. So we're going to have to hijack the form to not behave its traditional way. How do we do that? Well, we could do that with jQuery. We don't have to use jQuery, but it's easier. We're going to target the form, which is, I guess we could use the class name. Right? That's our form. And we can say form.onSubmit. We wanted to not submit the form, because that would kind of clear the page entirely, right? We want to kind of hijack the form behavior and do an asynchronous form submission. So we have to actually control that. The browser doesn't kind of have like an attribute to make it an AJAX form submit. We actually have to use, the AJAX functionality that we've seen already to do a post. Okay, so we're going to have to write JavaScript here. Now here's the thing. I'm still not hijacking the form. So for example, if I was to go back and look at my console, clear it out, and hit submit here, I see it do a stop, right, which is my console log. But it still attempts the post. And not only does it attempt it, it does it the traditional way, where it does it as a synchronous request. So I haven't actually stopped it yet. I can see that I have a function here that triggers. And in here, I can use a specific function to tell it to stop doing the default behavior. So like any event handler, there's an event object. If I console log the event object, I can see it has many methods. There's the event object. Hello. I guess it has these original event type, blah, 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 right? For whatever reason, it's not collapsing or expanding. Great. I can actually use the event object to say prevent default. And what that does is say, I've got this from here. Don't do the default behavior that this event results in. And the default behavior that this event results in is that the form submits, because it's a form submit event. So now, when I go to this page and hit submit, I can see I'm fully in control here, and the page is not changing. There is no actual form. In fact, it's not even failing on the submit, because there is no network request actually taking place. When I click this, no network request is taking place. I've essentially stopped the form from working at all. And now I have to make it work again, but using AJAX. Yep. It's listening to the whole form being submitted. What I didn't do, which is a common mistake, is I didn't say button click. This is a very common mistake. Why would button click be a mistake as an alternative? It would work in this example where I'm clicking this button, so it would appear to work. I would do a button, whatever that button class name is, .onClick, instead of form.onSubmit. Why is that a bad approach, even though it'll appear to work fine in my current test? Somebody, go for it. Yeah, you're exactly right, which is forms don't always submit by clicking the one button that's at the bottom of the form. An example of that is using enter on certain fields. Maybe not on the text area, but on a text field, I can hit enter, and it will actually submit the form. So that would bypass, the click wouldn't actually register. What's another example of where we don't click a button to submit a form? This one's a little bit more obscure, but it's very prevalent today. Think about how you submit forms these days. Yeah, on your computer, on your PC, you either click with the mouse or tap your screen, whatever, or you hit enter. But there's other devices that we use nowadays, phones. And sometimes the keyboard has the submit. Or return. Right? So specifically, that can also trigger a form submit, but it won't do a button click on your button. Right? So we want to definitely use the right event handler. Okay, and when this is hit, what we need is to make a post request. because we've hijacked this. We're not making any requests. So we're going to use the $.AJAX again, right? But this time, we're going to use a slightly different syntax. And again, there's shortcut methods that you will be using for Tweeter. You won't be using $AJAX, hopefully. You'll be using .post, which underlyingly uses $AJAX, but just makes it nicer so you don't have to be as verbose in your all the arguments that you're passing it. But I'll kind of use this approach here. So the URL is going to be creatures, and the method will be a post. And let's just do this and see what happens. Refresh. And whatever, I'll put some stuff in here, but we'll find that it doesn't get submitted because I haven't really used it yet. There. Immediately a creature's post takes place, and immediately it fails because of 404 not found. We don't have it implemented on the server side. Right? So Express is just confused. Why are you submitting this, right? But we can see that we did make an XHR request, so we're heading in the right direction, right? Just like before, I've caused an error. I need to fix it. So what I'm going to do is on the server side, I'm going to support the post. With a typical Express event handler, or sorry, route handler. And this route is not about fetching information, it's about submitting information. So I actually want to be able to see, I'll just send back like a, for now I'll just send back like a thank you. Or maybe I'll send back JSON. That's like just an object that says success true, right? Just to say like, yeah, you successfully submitted something. But let's just for now, let's take a look at the data that's coming through. Form data comes through, do you guys remember how form data comes through from TinyApp in Express? We have this thing we use called body parser, and it parses the form body from the payload, from HTTP request. And that allows us to just use it as an object. And that object is called request.body, if you recall, right? So I'm going to refresh this, or restart this. I'm going to hit refresh. I'm going to clear. I'm not going to preserve the log anymore, because that keeps all the old network logs in there. And then I'm going to hit submit. And that does a successful post. It comes back with a 200, right? Since we respond with JSON. There's our success true coming back. But in my console log, no data. Right? I am not sending up data yet, because I have to explicitly tell jQuery what to send up. And right now I haven't told it anything. I've just said make a post request and don't send any other data there. So I would actually have to provide another argument to the client code to say, not only are you making that request, but please send some data, right? And now the data can also be an object, because jQuery is nice like that. Even though ultimately it's going to get sent as a string, we can kind of give it a key value pair object. For example, I can say like name, all that stuff I can put in here. And now when I use the AJAX function, we'll see that it's submitting that as form data. I didn't get that information from a form. It's just call form data in the DevTools. And if we view it, it literally looks like a string, just like it does in a URL, right? Key equals value, ampersand, another key equals another value. This is called URL encoded, because it looks like it would in a URL. Another term for it is I think it's NVP, like named value pairs, something like that. In any case, it's a string with URL encoded style data. Cool. I don't want it to be obviously hard-coded to this. I want it to be the stuff that's in the form. So how would I get that? How would I get, instead of name KV, I would say name and then whatever they typed into the form. Or if you don't know, tell me how you'd find out. Peter, how would you find out? Yeah, like you essentially, the problem that we're trying to solve is we want this string to not be hard-coded. We want it to be whatever's typed in here. Now, they're at the point where they're submitting the form, so hopefully they've put some information there. Yep, so that would be my first step. Inspect it. Oh, it's an input field. It has a type text and a name, and in fact it has a class called creature name. So is that helpful or not? What would you do next? Okay, and how? We're in JavaScript here. We know that there's HTML that looks like this, that contains hopefully that value for us. I need to extract a value from that form field, right? So I would maybe Google jQuery form field value, extract or something like that. I mean, Google's so nice these days, right? Literally gives me the answer without having to click into the thing. But let's assume we didn't know that was the answer. jQuery val method. It says to set the value of the input field. Well, we want to fetch the value. That's not really the answer we want, because this is setting the value of a given input. But then we look below, and it says the val method returns or sets the value. So you can actually do both, the way jQuery's created it. This method returns the value of the value attribute of the first matched element. So this is how you use it to get the value. So all I have to do is target that form control, which has a class creature name, I believe. Right? So I target it using jQuery, and then I say, oh, on that element, I want to call .val because I want the value of it. Right? And the same thing for creature age. And the same thing for creature type, I think it is. Right? Let's just make sure those are the class names. Creature name, creature type, and sorry, it's, what did I do? Not age, it's damage, right? So now we're setting 3 keys and values up, and hopefully we're retrieving them right when we're creating this object. We're saying, hold on, the value, we need to use jQuery to access the DOM and access the value first. So JavaScript, of course, it being JavaScript, we'll need to run this piece of code in order to establish what this whole object, kind of what the key value pair there is, right? You guys with me so far? Yeah? So let's go ahead and refresh and restart. And now, opening up the network tab before I submit, I'm going to type in something here. Unicorn Joe is a unicorn. I'm not very creative with my name. Sorry, guys. Unicorns are pretty badass. So this one's going to be like crazy damage. And submit. And now what we want to see is, did our form data change? And indeed it did, because we dynamically accessed those values right when we were about to make that request. And we can see our console log that we had created on the server is no longer an empty object. Request.body is actually the data that's coming into the server, because we're making a good, well-formed request with the form data, right? And it's getting sent to the server, and it's being turned into an object again, because that's how we like to store data, right? So on the server now, I need to actually store this creature data in that array. So I'm just going to do something like creatures.push creature data. Though to be honest, it probably needs an ID as well. I'm just going to be lazy and forget about that right now, because we're not using the IDs anyway, so whatever. But essentially, you'd want to keep track of IDs and then increment them if you were doing it this way, right? That's not the goal of this lecture, so I'm just going to leave that so that we have enough time. And so now we've added to the creatures array. So that means if I console log creatures right now, it's going to be a length of 3. Agreed? Because it starts with 2. So let's restart. And let's resubmit. This form is already filled out. So I'm just going to submit it again, which submits the exact same data again. And we see that creature's length is 3. And if I submit it again without restarting the app, and again, that should be 5, and so on. Does that make sense, what we did there? If not, we'll do a quick review. But before that, is there anything else we want to do? Oh, this is not still a fully functioning, like it's not behaving like a nice app where when I add something, I don't really get, like, nothing really happens, right? The form stays the same. I get no success message, or at least the form should clear, or ideally, the data should refresh below. Agreed? So I would argue that we're not done here, that in the client code, after the AJAX is done, right? So in here, I need a .then on success, right? And the data that's coming back, by the way, is just that success true, right? That success true that we sent back. So maybe we just want to see if success was true or not. Right? If data.success is true, is truthy, then we are good to update the list below. How do we update the list below? And we need to clear the form. You know, I could be really lazy here, and I could just do window.location.reload, which will basically trigger a refresh on the page. But that's the exact opposite of what we want, because we don't want the page to completely refresh, because there could have been something else on the page. Maybe there's a chat window on the bottom right, a la Facebook, and everything will kind of refresh there. That's going to be annoying, right? But let's just see this in action. I think it's window window.location.reload. So not what we want, but just to illustrate that you could be lazy and do it that way in certain situations. I put something in. I want it to be at the bottom of this. I hit submit. On success, it refreshes the page, which then makes the request again, because the whole page is just loaded again. And then we see that thing show up at the bottom. So end result is still the same. The user experience isn't as great, though, because the whole page, we saw the page reload. So we're going to want to do this using JavaScript, using programmatic approach. And instead of doing this, which is effectively clicking that refresh button, we are going to empty the form out ourselves, right? So that means each of these needs to be emptied out. How do I empty it out? Turns out like that, right? Or I think there's a .empty. Maybe there isn't. Could be mistaken. But I think the empty, actually, I might be mistaken about how it works. It removes all child nodes, so that's not what I want. I want to actually empty the value, so that's going to be val empty string. All right, so we empty the form. Let's make sure that's happening. I forget the Wyvern's name in Game of Thrones. What is it? There's a bunch, right? Whatever. Whatever doesn't have much damage. Great, it emptied the form, but nothing is changing below, right? So we need to obviously write some code for that as well. All we're doing right now is emptying the form. How do I go ahead and update that list? What could I do? There's a couple different patterns I could use here. Well, I know that the user has typed in some information, right? And right before I clear it, I have the information. So I could actually just append another creature to the list. Couldn't I? I have full access to the DOM. I could say, you know, creatures list dot append, and then I call that function to like build creature element and pass in the data, and it would give me back the jQuery DOM node. I could do it that way. I'm going to keep that commented in, but I'm not going to do it that way. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to trigger the same piece of code that goes ahead and fetches the list from the server. Remember that code that runs when the page loads? Right? Where's that? It's right here. So why don't we turn that into a function? Something like this, so that we can call it multiple times. And on page load, we definitely want it to run, so we'll call it right away after declaring it. But it's there to be called later as well. So we define this as a function now to say, please update the creature list. And then it will make the AJAX request and build out the creatures. And then we immediately on page load also need to call it because it's empty at the beginning and we want to update the creature list. So we're still doing what we were doing before. But now I can call this as a function in here too. Update creature list. And so I clear the form and I update the creature list on success. Let's restart and refresh. There's our stuff still working. And then I add, not really a mythical creature, but here we go. It worked, except there's a bug. It repeated the old data, and then it added me. There should be 3 things here. There's now like 5. Why is that happening? Because when it fetches, it's still getting back 3 things, right? Or in this case, if I do another one, the creatures JSON is going to come back with 4 things, 0, 1, 2, 3. But then this page is just getting bigger and bigger. It's way more than 4 there. Why is that happening? Any ideas? Yeah, exactly. It's getting back 4 things. It's fetching 4 things, and then build creatures is appending. So whatever's existing in there stays. So that page just keeps getting longer and longer instead of only getting longer by 1. So what we need to do is, before we loop, we need to make sure that we've emptied this out. Right? And then we can append more stuff into it. It's one approach anyway. Again, there's many different approaches for DOM manipulation. This is just the way I'm doing it for lecture. Doesn't mean this is exactly how you'll do it for Twitter or in future cases. Let's make sure that works. So we have our 2, right? And now we have our 3rd, right? And if now I don't have any validation, so if I just submit without any type or whatever, it's still going to submit. And I can keep adding stuff. And we've got that delay on the server side, which is why we see a delay of a second before it shows up. Because that second request for getting the creatures is taking a second before it comes back. It sucks, though, from a UX perspective that the user doesn't really notice that like the list is updating, right? So maybe what I'll do is just quickly, I know we're a bit over time, but just to show you how easy it is, using CSS and some of the stuff you've already learned, I'm going to, when it's making the request, right before making the request for AJAX to get the list, it's going to creatures list, is it? What is that list called? Yeah, creatures list. We're just going to add a class onto it called loading. And what loading will do is it'll just be and I'll just be lazy right now and be quick. And I'll just put in some style right into here instead of making it a separate file. And I'll just put anything that has a class loading has an opacity of, let's say, 0.3. So it's going to be a little bit lighter, a lot lighter. It's going to be a little bit translucent. And in the case of the creatures list, we don't want it to suddenly go opaque and then suddenly come back. Oh, and by the way, when it's done loading, we need to remove that class. So once we get back in the build creatures, where's build creatures? Up here. Once we're done looping and creating these things, we want to remove that class using jQuery. Right? So the class is only there when the AJAX request is made and while it's waiting. And then as soon as it's done and it's created all the DOM elements, it takes away that class. So now that class is we're going to notice it go opaque and then come back. And in fact, I should be able to even demo that by itself without going further. Let's see if that's true. Refresh. Add something. We see that it does a nice little. Of course, I could have a spinner that I decide to show or hide or something like that. But what I like to do is whenever I have transitions like that, I like to use the new or newish CSS transition. So I want to set a transition for maybe 0.2 seconds on opacity. I forget the exact syntax for this. I think it's something like this. You can look it up. So now it'll actually slowly go to opacity, whatever opacity is set to, and then slowly come back over 200 milliseconds. So it feels a little bit nicer. Maybe let's make it 300 milliseconds. So we see it kind of transition to fade, like it fades into opacity and then it fades back, right? You see that? Without using any JavaScript, except for obviously adding the class and removing the class. I didn't have to use an animation library to fade things in and out thanks to CSS's transition. Not really in the scope of lecture, but I wanted to show you how quick and easy it is. And it'll be in the code that I give you guys as well. So it's 12:06, I know, but I'd like to do a little bit of a review, so maybe we'll go to 12:10, and then we'll be done at that point. Let's just quickly review what we did here. So page loads without any data, right? On DOM load, or document ready, same thing. We trigger a fetch using get via AJAX, right? We use jQuery for this. And we hit up get creatures.json. Server returns current database content. So there's 2 items, right? As a JSON string. jQuery notices JSON coming back and uses JSON.parse behind the scenes to convert that string into an array of creature data, right? Our callback is triggered with the data. At which point, callback uses additional functions to generate the DOM nodes for appending creatures one by one to the list. It does this safely, avoiding the security vulnerability that we talked about earlier, which you can Google later if you like. It's called XSS, cross-site scripting. And then what happens after that? Pretty much that's it, right? Like the page loads, that happens. And then when the user submits a form, well, I guess I should say it also adds an event listener to the form submit event, right? When the user submits a form, our listener is called. It uses event.prevent default to stop the event from propagating up the tree and resulting in its actually, it doesn't actually prevent it from propagating up the tree. That's a lie. It just stops the event from, it just signals to the browser not to do the default behavior for that event. There's another way to stop it from actually going up the tree, which is a different topic where you use return false. You don't say event.prevent default. But if you're not sure what I just said, that's OK. We'll worry about that later. And then it uses jQuery's AJAX code, AJAX function, to do a post. And before doing that, fetches the form values. By the way, I forgot to show you. I showed you the more kind of arduous way to fetch the entire form. You know, what if there was like 10 fields in here? What if it was like a really long form? That's a lot of code. Why don't we just have a function, jQuery gives us one, where we can just say, take all the form fields, please, and convert them to an object. And so there is something in jQuery called serialize. So we'll take we already have a handle on the form, so we'll say form.serialize, which is really nice. We can call this anytime. So for example, I can fill out this form right now, right? And let's just use like the REPL here to simulate that. So what is the form called? New creature form. So in here, using jQuery, just to show you the point, I'm going to access the form. There's my form. Form.serialize. This is a jQuery function that will take the values of the form. It actually doesn't convert it to an object, my bad. It converts it to a string. And that's the exact same string that needs to be sent up anyway. So it's the URL encoded string ready to go. We don't need to like manually access each form field. So this is a common pattern that's used in jQuery. So I'm going to keep the old there, but comment it out and show you the better approach.
But for cleaning the form, you need to do it for each of the.
Yeah, for cleaning the form, I think you have to use each of the things. I'm not sure though. You might want to Google that. OK, so then it uses AJAX function to do a post, and before doing that, fetches the form values. No, we'll just say with the serialized form. Upon success, our AJAX callback does two things. Clears the form and calls a function to refetch the entire list. Why did I refetch the entire list? Why didn't I just add the data that I already had locally, which would save me a network request? I don't have to go fetch a new list. I already have the new item that should have been in that list, and I can just manually add that in, and it will even be faster. Because what if that request is slow? You know, it's feeling slower. The whole UI is feeling slower. So what's the advantage in refreshing the whole list? Why would that still be a good approach, despite the negatives? You're onto something, but you're not saying it exactly. What you're saying sounds like it's the right answer, but I don't know if you're fully understanding the advantage of requesting the list again, even though you know what the end result list is likely going to be.
By the time the whole like request and response process like complete, your database might have changed.
Exactly. Not even just during that point, but I could have old data because it's a website, right? So I could have loaded it today, And then tomorrow, I go back to my browser, right? I open up my laptop, go back to the page. It doesn't auto-refresh unless I hit refresh on the page, right? So now that list could have potentially changed because many people have submitted new stuff. When I go to submit the form, it shouldn't just show me my value added because that's lying to me. It's not just a list of 4 creatures. It's a list of 400 potentially because stuff has changed between yesterday and today. So now it's going to actually update with all the data, not just what it assumes to be the correct data. So it's a real, like, give me all the truth. Give me all of the actual data that's in the database. It's a bit slower, but it's not making any assumptions about other stuff happening that other users are doing to that database. Right? So it's really just a decision. Now, when you're architecting your app, you have to decide whether that's important or if performance is important or if there's some other strategy you want to employ. But ultimately, we have full control about the workflow and how data is updated. Cool. So I'll send out these notes. The review notes are in there too, and the code will be in there as well. Thanks, guys. Cheers.